It was an early morning in Silverbrook, a small, quiet town where nothing much ever happened. The sun had just started to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the sleepy streets. As the town slowly began to wake up, Mark Evans, a local delivery driver, was on his usual route. He had made this trip countless times before, but that day was different. As he drove along a narrow road leading to a dense forest on the outskirts of town, something caught his eye. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a dark shape lying in the underbrush near the trees. But as he got closer, a sense of unease crept over him. Mark slowed his truck and pulled over, the engine humming softly as he stepped out to investigate. The air was cool, and the morning fog still lingered in the air, giving the woods an eerie, almost surreal quality. He walked cautiously toward the shape, his heart beginning to race. When he got closer, he realized with a shock that it was the body of a young woman. Her lifeless form lay on the cold ground, her clothes torn and disheveled. Mark's mind raced as he took in the scene. Her hair was matted with dirt, and her skin was pale, almost as if she had been there for days. The most unsettling part was her eyes, wide open, as if staring blankly at something in the distance. It was clear she was beyond help, but Mark's immediate instinct was to run back to his truck and call the authorities. With shaking hands, Mark dialed the police, trying to keep his voice steady as he reported the discovery. Within minutes, the first responders arrived. Police cars, ambulances, and the coroner's van, all converging on the scene. Detective Laura Mitchell was one of the first on the scene. She had been working in Silverbrook for years, but nothing in her career had prepared her for what she was about to face. As she knelt down beside the woman's body, the sight sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just a typical case of a tragic accident or a random death. There was something deeply disturbing about it, something that spoke of malice, of cruelty. The victim was a young woman, possibly in her early 20s, with no identification on her. There were no bags, no wallet, no phone, nothing that could help the police determine who she was or how she had ended up in such a remote location. There were no signs of a struggle at the scene, but the woman's body showed signs of significant trauma. Her arms were bruised, her face battered, and her clothes were torn in strange, deliberate ways. The detective's mind raced, trying to piece together the circumstances that led to such a horrific end. The area surrounding the body was eerily quiet, and the dense trees seemed to close in around them, adding to the unsettling feeling in the air. Detective Mitchell instructed her team to search for any clues, footprints, bloodstains, or anything that could point them toward an answer. But everything seemed to be deliberately concealed, as if the killer had carefully planned the scene, to make it difficult for the police to figure out what had happened. The only thing that was clear was that the woman had been brought to this spot. But why? Who could have done something so cold and calculated? As the investigation began, the police focused on identifying the woman. Missing persons reports were checked, and her image was circulated around town, but there were no immediate leads. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere. Detective Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial, something that could break open the case. But at that moment, there were only more questions than answers. As the days passed, the investigation into the young woman's death began to spiral into a complex web of confusion and unanswered questions. The police were no closer to identifying her, and the lack of evidence at the crime scene only added to the mystery. Detective Laura Mitchell felt a growing sense of frustration. Every lead they followed seemed to end in a dead end. No one in the town had reported seeing anything unusual in the days leading up to the discovery, and no one could recall anything about the victim. It was as though she had never existed. The autopsy report provided little clarity. The woman's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, but there was no indication of a struggle. This struck the detective as strange. In many cases of violent crime, there are signs of a fight or resistance, but here, the body had been carefully positioned, almost as if she had been placed at the scene after the crime. The police were left with no tangible clues, no fingerprints, no DNA, and nothing that could point to a suspect. But one detail in the report sent a chill down the detective's spine. The woman's teeth had been removed, violently ripped from her mouth, leaving a gruesome void. This act, horrifying and deliberate, spoke of a level of cruelty beyond the norm, and it hinted at something far more sinister. Detective Mitchell ordered a more thorough search of the area. The location of the body was so remote that it seemed like the killer had planned it meticulously. A forest edge, hidden from the main road, seemed like the perfect place to dispose of a body without anyone noticing. But even with the added scrutiny, nothing else stood out. There were no additional clues hidden in the trees, no discarded items that might have belonged to the victim or the killer. It was as if the scene had been perfectly staged, as though the person responsible had done everything they could to leave no trace. With no obvious leads, the police decided to canvass the town for any signs of someone acting strangely or any unusual activities in the days leading up to the murder. But Silverbrook was a small, tight-knit community, and people tended to mind their own business. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary. It was almost as if the woman had been invisible in her own town. This made the investigation even more troubling. It wasn't just that the crime was horrific. It was that no one seemed to know anything about the woman, and no one had heard of her before. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. Detective Mitchell's team began reaching out to neighboring towns and cities, trying to see if anyone had reported a missing person who might match the description of the victim. They were running out of options, and the case was quickly becoming a mystery that seemed impossible to solve. Yet, just when they thought they had reached an impasse, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local nurse, who had been following the case in the news, came forward with a crucial piece of information. She recalled a woman matching the description of the victim coming into the emergency room a few months earlier. The nurse remembered treating a young woman named Anna Walker, who had arrived at the hospital with bruises on her face and signs of severe emotional distress. She had claimed to have been in a car accident, but the nurse had always felt there was more to the story. At the time, Anna hadn't wanted to file a police report, and the hospital had let it slide, dismissing it as a private matter. But now, after seeing the news of the body's discovery, the nurse realized that the woman she had treated might be the same person. The new lead, though small, gave the detectives a new direction. Detective Mitchell now had a name: Anna Walker. But as the team began digging into Anna's past, they found more questions than answers. No one seemed to know much about her. She had never been married, had no children, and there were no records of close family. In fact, Anna had lived in Silverbrook for years, but she had always kept to herself. Her name had never come up in any local gossip, and no one could recall seeing her with friends or acquaintances. It was as if she had been a ghost in her own community. As the investigation deepened, the police began to suspect that the young woman's life was far more complicated than anyone had realized. Her quiet, solitary existence seemed like a puzzle, and Detective Mitchell couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Anna's story than just the tragic end that had been uncovered. The detective's instinct told her that Anna's past held the key to understanding why she had been killed and, perhaps, who had killed her. The case, which had seemed like an unsolvable mystery, was now taking an unexpected turn. The more they learned about Anna's life, the more they realized that the truth might be far darker than they had ever imagined. The more Detective Mitchell dug into Anna Walker's past, the more unsettling details emerged. It was as if the quiet, reserved woman had been hiding a dark secret, one that no one in Silverbrook had ever suspected. Anna had lived in the town for several years, but very few people had known much about her. She had kept to herself, avoiding social gatherings and never interacting with neighbors. There were whispers that she had a troubled history, but no one could pinpoint exactly what that meant. As the investigation continued, the detective began to uncover the hidden layers of Anna's life, each more disturbing than the last. The first breakthrough came when the police traced Anna's employment history. She had worked as a waitress at a local diner for a few years, but her time there had ended abruptly. According to her former co-workers, Anna had been a quiet, hard-working woman, but she had stopped coming to work about 6 months before her death. She had given no explanation, and her co-workers hadn't thought much of it. The manager, however, remembered something strange. Anna had come to work one day with a noticeable bruise on her face. She had claimed it was nothing, just a minor accident, but the manager had found it odd. The bruise was so severe that it didn't look like a mere slip-and-fall injury. But again, Anna refused to discuss it, and the manager didn't press the issue. The more the detective learned about Anna's time at the diner, the more it became clear that she had been hiding something from everyone. There were no close friends, no confidants, and no one who could shed light on what had been going on in her life. It was as if Anna had been living a secret life, one that she had kept hidden from the world. This only deepened the mystery surrounding her death. What had driven her to isolate herself so completely? And more importantly, who had been responsible for the violence that had been inflicted upon her? As Detective Mitchell dug deeper, she uncovered records that connected Anna to a man named George Lancaster. George had lived in Silverbrook for many years and was known as a quiet, unassuming man. He worked as a mechanic and was generally considered a good neighbor by most people in the town. However, as the detective reviewed his background, she began to find disturbing details that painted a very different picture. George had a criminal record, one that had been mostly forgotten by the people of Silverbrook. Years earlier, he had been arrested for assault after an altercation with a former girlfriend. The charges had been dropped after the victim refused to press charges, but the incident had left a stain on George's reputation. Since then, he had kept a low profile, living a solitary life and working in his shop. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that George had a history of violence, and his connection to Anna was no coincidence. Detective Mitchell discovered that Anna and George had been in a relationship for several years, though it was never publicly acknowledged. They had kept their relationship a secret, and no one in town had known they were involved. The more the detective learned about their relationship, the more troubling it became. Anna had been the victim of constant abuse at the hands of George. Neighbors reported hearing loud arguments coming from their house, but no one ever intervened. Anna had kept her suffering hidden, perhaps out of fear or shame, but there were signs that her relationship with George had been far more toxic than anyone had realized. The abuse had escalated over time, with George becoming more controlling and violent. Anna had confided in a few people over the years, though she never spoke directly about the abuse. One woman who had worked with her at the diner recalled Anna mentioning that she was afraid to leave George, but she never went into detail. It seemed that Anna had been trapped in a cycle of fear and isolation, unable to escape the man who had slowly destroyed her life. The more Detective Mitchell uncovered, the clearer it became that George Lancaster was the key to solving the case. He had been abusive, manipulative, and controlling, and it seemed likely that his violence had eventually driven him to murder. But the detective couldn't understand why Anna had stayed with him for so long. What had kept her in that relationship? Even after everything that had happened? Was there something more to her story that the police had missed? As the investigation began to focus on George, the detective felt a growing sense of dread. She knew that the case was far from over, and that there were still many unanswered questions. But one thing was certain: the truth about Anna's life and her tragic end was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. And it seemed that George Lancaster held the answers that, if found, would reveal the true horror of what had happened to Anna Walker. Detective Mitchell's suspicion grew stronger as she focused on George Lancaster. The pieces were slowly coming together, but there was still much to uncover. The more she learned about George, the more it seemed like he was the key to unraveling Anna's tragic death. It was clear that George had been violent with Anna, but the question remained: had his abuse escalated to the point of murder, or was there something else at play that the police had yet to discover? As the investigation continued, the police learned more about George's activities in the days leading up to Anna's death. A deeper look into his whereabouts revealed something unsettling. George had been absent for several days around the time Anna's body had been discovered. He had told his friends and family that he had been out of town, working on a job in a nearby city. But the police couldn't confirm his alibi. Surveillance footage from local businesses showed George leaving Silverbrook in the days before Anna's body was found, but there was no sign of him returning. It was as if he had simply disappeared from the town during the crucial window of time. George's sudden absence raised a number of red flags for Detective Mitchell. It wasn't just that he was gone, it was the way he had vanished, without a trace. He had gone off the grid, and no one seemed to know where he had gone or when he would return. His neighbors, who had once seen him regularly, reported that he hadn't been home for days, and his shop had been closed during the same period. It was as though he had intentionally removed himself from the town, as if he knew something was coming and wanted to avoid being caught. The detective decided to focus her attention on George's whereabouts during the time Anna had been killed. She began to trace his movements, checking gas station records and speaking to truck drivers who had passed through the area. It was then that she got an unexpected tip. A truck driver, who had been in the area around the time of Anna's death, mentioned seeing a man matching George's description at a rest stop on the outskirts of town. The man had been acting strangely, looking over his shoulder and staying in his truck for long periods of time. The truck driver didn't think much of it at the time, but now, in light of the investigation, he realized the significance of his encounter. The detective now had a crucial piece of the puzzle. If George had been in the area during the time of Anna's death, it was possible that he had been the one to kill her. But the more she thought about it, the more she questioned his motives. Why would he murder Anna? Yes, he had been abusive, but murder seemed like a step too far. There had to be something more, some hidden element to the case that the police had missed. In the meantime, the police continued to dig into George's past, hoping to find something that could shed light on his possible motives. They discovered that George had once been in a brief relationship with another woman before Anna, a relationship that had ended under mysterious circumstances. The woman, who had since moved away, claimed that George had been obsessive and controlling, constantly monitoring her every move. She had left him after he had threatened her, but she had never reported him to the authorities. This new piece, of information only deepened the mystery, showing a pattern of behavior that was both abusive and dangerous. Detective Mitchell felt like she was getting closer to understanding George's motivations, but there was still one critical piece missing. She needed to know more about what had happened in the days leading up to Anna's murder. Had Anna tried to leave George for good? Had he snapped in a moment of rage when he realized she was planning to escape him once and for all? The detective couldn't help but feel that there was a hidden, darker truth behind Anna's death, one that was still just out of reach. With no concrete evidence linking George directly to the murder, the detective decided to take a risk. She ordered a search of his property, hoping to find something, anything that would tie him to Anna's death. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. As the search team combed through George's house and workshop, the detective felt a mounting sense of anticipation. She knew that they were close to something big, something that would break the case wide open. Then, as they searched a small shed behind George's house, they found it. A blood-stained shirt, hidden in a locked box. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push the investigation to the next level. The shirt was sent for analysis, and the results came back with a shocking revelation. The blood on the shirt matched Anna's DNA. It was the breakthrough Detective Mitchell had been waiting for. With this piece of evidence, they could finally arrest George and charge him with Anna's murder. The detective felt a mix of relief and dread. The case was far from over, but the discovery had brought them closer to the truth. George Lancaster had not only been hiding in plain sight, he had been hiding a deadly secret. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn, and now, the real story behind Anna Walker's death was beginning to unfold. The arrest of George Lancaster sent shockwaves through Silverbrook, a town that had always prided itself on its peaceful nature. People couldn't believe that one of their own, a quiet mechanic who had lived among them for years, could be responsible for such a horrific crime. But for Detective Mitchell, the arrest was just the beginning. With George in custody, the investigation had entered a new and more dangerous phase. Now they had to uncover the full truth about what happened to Anna Walker and why. As the days passed, the pressure mounted for the police to build a strong case against George. His initial denial of any involvement in Anna's death was expected, but his behavior during questioning raised more questions than it answered. George insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder, and that he hadn't even seen Anna in weeks before her death. His alibi, the one he had presented to his family and friends, had started to fall apart under scrutiny. The truck driver who had seen him at the rest stop had no doubt that it had been George, and that was just one more piece of evidence stacking against him. But George remained calm and composed, refusing to admit anything, even as the evidence piled up against him. The interrogation went on for hours, with Detective Mitchell pushing George harder, trying to get him to crack. But George remained steadfast in his innocence. It was only when the blood-stained shirt, found hidden on his property, was presented to him that his demeanor began to shift. The evidence was undeniable. Anna's blood had been found on the shirt, and it was enough to warrant a charge of murder. But George still didn't break. He refused to explain why he had the shirt or how it came to be stained with Anna's blood. It was as if he was protecting something, or someone, even at the cost of his own freedom. Frustration grew as the days turned into weeks. Despite the mounting evidence, George refused to cooperate. He was charged with Anna's murder. But the prosecutor's office knew that they needed more than just circumstantial evidence to secure a conviction. Without a clear motive or confession, it would be a difficult case to win. The detective knew that finding out why George had killed Anna was the key to cracking the case wide open, but George was still keeping his secrets close to his chest. Then, an unexpected breakthrough came in the form of a letter. A woman who had once been involved with George years earlier reached out to the police. She had heard about the case and felt compelled to share her experience. In the letter, she described her relationship with George and the terrifying pattern of obsessive behavior that had escalated over time. She wrote that George had a tendency to lash out when he felt rejected, and that he had threatened her when she had tried to leave him. Her account painted a chilling picture of a man who would stop at nothing to control the women in his life. The woman's letter provided crucial context for George's actions and motivations. It confirmed the suspicions that had been building for weeks, that George was capable of extreme violence, especially when he felt betrayed or threatened. But the letter didn't explain everything. The detective still had no clear understanding of what had triggered George's violent outburst toward Anna. Had she finally decided to leave him? Had she tried to escape, pushing George over the edge? As the investigation continued, the police began to piece together the final details. They discovered that Anna had planned to leave George. She had made arrangements to move to a new town, and she had even confided in a few people about her decision. Her desire to escape from George had been growing for months, and the abusive relationship she had been trapped in for so long had finally reached a breaking point. Anna's efforts to leave were the catalyst that pushed George to murder her. It became clear that George's fear of losing control over Anna had driven him to kill. The moment Anna tried to leave, George saw it as an ultimate betrayal, and it was then that the violence escalated. The detective believed that George had confronted Anna, perhaps in a fit of rage, and killed her in the heat of the moment. The removal of her teeth, a brutal and symbolic act, was likely a way for George to assert his dominance over her, to strip away her identity in the most grotesque way possible. In the end, the trial revealed the full extent of George Lancaster's cruelty. He was convicted of first-degree murder, and the town of Silverbrook was left to grapple with the shock of learning the truth about one of their own. The case was a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors, even in the most unsuspecting places. Anna Walker's tragic death had exposed a hidden world of abuse and control, and the people of Silverbrook were left with the painful realization that evil could be present in their midst, hidden beneath the surface of their everyday lives. For Detective Mitchell, the case was both a triumph and a tragedy. She had solved the case and brought justice to Anna, but the horror of what had happened still weighed heavily on her. The investigation had revealed the ugly reality of domestic violence, and it was a truth that many people had chosen to ignore for too long. But in the end, Anna's story had been told, and the truth had been uncovered, no matter how dark it was.